The results are in. I am so sorry, Rafael.
No. I don't believe it.
The doctor slid the paper across the desk, and Rafael Duarte read the word EXCLUDED next to his own name. And in the next room, his 5-year-old son was dying, and the test was telling him that the boy was not his to save.
They're hiding.
I want to be clear about what this means, the geneticist said carefully, not meeting his eyes. Based on the standard paternity analysis, the probability that you are Lucas's biological father is 0%. It's the same result for both of your other children. I'm very sorry. I know this is not what anyone expected. 0%. Rafael sat very still, a paramedic who had held strangers' broken bodies together on the worst nights of their lives. A man who did not panic, who was trained not to panic, and he felt the floor of his entire life quietly disappear. Because he knew what this paper meant, or what everyone in that room believed it meant. It meant that the 3 children he had raised from their first breath, the 3 children he had walked the floor with at 3 in the morning, whose fevers he had broken, and whose bikes he had fixed, and whose names were tattooed over his heart, were not his. It meant, as his father-in-law would say out loud within the hour, that his wife had lied to him for 11 years. And most unbearable of all, it meant that little Lucas, sick with leukemia in the next room, waiting for the bone marrow transplant, that was his only chance to live, could not receive it from the father who would have given him every cell in his body. Because on paper, that father was a stranger. His wife, Marisol, was already crying, already saying, no, this is wrong, there's a mistake, Rafa, I swear on my life. And Rafael reached over and took her hand. And here's the thing that the doctor would remember years later and could never quite explain. The man did not doubt her. He did not turn on her. He looked at a laboratory result that said his whole life was a lie, and then he looked at his wife of 11 years, and he chose her over the paper. I know these are my kids, Rafael said quietly, to the doctor, to the room, to the universe. I don't care what that says. There is an answer we're not seeing yet, and we are going to find it before my son runs out of time. He was right. There was an answer. It was hiding inside his own body, in a secret he had carried since before he was born, a secret so rare that only a handful of people on Earth have ever lived it. But nobody in that room knew it yet. All they knew was that the clock was running on a little boy's life, and that a wealthy, furious man named Gerald Whitmore had just been handed the weapon he'd spent 15 years praying for. How can a father's own children not be his? How does a man prove a truth that science itself seems to deny before his son runs out of time? You have to go back to a young paramedic, a girl whose father hated him, and a wedding that half the guests came to sneer at. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if anyone has ever tried to tell you that the family you love isn't really yours, stay with me. This one is going to hit home. Rafael Duarte fell in love with Marisol Whitmore on the worst night of her life, which is a strange way to start a marriage, but a true one. And the way it happened tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He was 25, 3 years into the job, driving an ambulance on a rainy October night when a call came in for a single-car accident on the highway out past the good part of town. The car had spun on wet asphalt into the median. Inside was a terrified 23-year-old woman with a broken wrist and a cut on her forehead and a full-blown panic attack. And while his partner worked on the mechanics of getting her out, Rafael did the thing he was quietly famous for at the station. He talked to her. He held her uninjured hand, and he kept his voice low and even, and he told her she was going to be fine, that he had her, that the hardest part was already over. And by the time they loaded her into the rig, she had stopped shaking, and she was looking at the calm, brown-eyed man who had appeared out of the rain to tell her she was safe. Her name was Marisol. She would tell people, for the rest of her life, that she met her husband on the night she thought she was going to die, and that the first thing he ever did was refuse to let her be afraid. The problem was Marisol's father, Gerald Whitmore was a self-made real estate developer, a hard, glossy man who had clawed his way up from nothing and had, like a certain kind of man who claws his way up, decided that anyone still down where he'd started must have deserved to stay there. He had exactly one daughter and enormous plans for her, and none of those plans involved a Mexican-American paramedic from the East Side who made $41,000 a year and rented a one-bedroom apartment. When Marisol brought Rafael home for the first time, Gerald spent the entire dinner asking questions designed to humiliate him. About his salary, about his people, about what he could possibly imagine he had to offer a Whitmore. Rafael answered every question with a steadiness that only made Gerald angrier, because Gerald was a man who mistook calm for weakness and would spend 15 years failing to understand that Rafael Duarte was the least weak person he had ever met. When Marisol announced they were engaged, her father gave her a choice: the family or the ambulance driver. Marisol chose Rafael. Gerald did not come to the wedding, and he made sure, through 100 small cruelties, that a good number of the guests who did come understood they were watching a Whitmore throw her life away. That was the beginning of the marriage, a young couple, deeply in love, with a rich and powerful man on the outside of it who had decided that the husband was a mistake to be corrected. For 15 years, Gerald Whitmore never stopped waiting for Rafael to fail. He waited for the marriage to collapse under the weight of money problems. He waited for Rafael to cheat, or drink, or run, the way he had decided men like that always eventually do. He offered Marisol money with strings on it, always with strings, always structured to make Rafael feel small. And year after year, to Gerald's baffled fury, the marriage did not fail. It thrived, because Rafael Duarte was, in every way that Gerald could not measure on a balance sheet, exactly the man his daughter had thought he was on that rainy highway. He was steady. He showed up. He loved her without conditions, which was a thing Marisol had never once experienced in her father's house, and it healed something in her that she had not known was broken. They had 3 children. Sophia came first, serious and watchful, with her mother's chin and her father's calm. Then Mateo, all motion, a boy who could not sit still, who wanted to be a paramedic like his dad from the age of 4. And then, 5 years before the day of the test, came Lucas, the baby, the surprise, a sweet, dreamy little boy who fell asleep in strange places and laughed at his own jokes and turned his tough paramedic father into pure liquid the moment he was born. Rafael raised those 3 children with a completeness that people noticed. He worked hard shifts and came home and got down on the floor. He knew the pediatrician's number by heart. He was, by every account of everyone who ever saw them together, a father in the deepest sense of the word, and the idea that those children were anything other than his would have struck anyone who knew the family as not just wrong but insane. And then Lucas got sick. It started with bruises that didn't make sense, and a tiredness that didn't fit a 5-year-old. And Rafael, who knew enough medicine to be terrified, pushed for the tests before the pediatrician thought they were necessary. And the tests came back, and the word was leukemia. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The floor of the world opened up under the Duarte family, the way it opens up under thousands of families every year. And Rafael and Marisol did what those families do. They learned a new and terrible vocabulary. They lived in hospital chairs. They watched their dreamy little boy endure things no child should endure. Chemotherapy that made his hair fall out and his body shrink. And Lucas bore it with a sweetness that broke everyone around him. And for a while it seemed to be working. And then it came back. And when it came back, the doctors told them what the last hope was. Lucas needed a bone marrow transplant, and he needed a donor. And the best odds by far, the doctors explained, come from a sibling or a parent. So the whole family went in to be tested, to be typed, to find the match that would save Lucas's life. You need to understand what those months were like before the test, because it is the reason Rafael had nothing left in reserve when the paper came. Childhood leukemia does not just attack the child. It moves into a family and rearranges every room. Rafael kept working. because they needed the insurance and they needed the money. So he would run a 12-hour shift pulling people out of car wrecks, and then drive straight to the hospital and sleep 4 hours in a vinyl chair and do it again. Marisol essentially moved into Lucas's room. Sophia, 9, became a small adult overnight, making her own lunches, comforting her little brother Mateo, 7, who did not understand why everyone was sad, and started wetting the bed again and getting in trouble at school. The family stretched itself in every direction to cover a hole that could not be covered. And they did it the way families do, without discussing it. Each person quietly carrying more than they could hold. And through all of it, the one steady beam holding the whole structure up was Rafael. He was the one who could read the charts and translate them. He was the one who could make Lucas laugh even on the chemo days, doing terrible impressions of the nurses. He was the one who held Marisol at 2 in the morning when the fear got too big to carry alone. Take that beam out of a structure that's stressed, and the whole thing comes down. That is exactly what the DNA result threatened to do, and that is exactly why Gerald reached for it. The first remission had felt like winning. Lucas rang the little bell they have on the oncology ward the day he finished his protocol, and the nurses cheered. And the family cried and went home and tried to remember how to be ordinary. They got 4 months. 4 months of Lucas's hair growing back and soft and new, of him falling asleep in the laundry basket, of Rafael letting himself believe the worst was behind them. And then a routine check found the blasts back in his blood. More of them, more aggressive, and the doctors' faces changed, and the word this time was relapse, and the plan this time was not another round of the same chemo. The plan was a transplant, and a transplant needs a donor, and the search for a donor is what sent the whole family into the typing lab on an ordinary Thursday, hopeful, holding hands, walking straight into the second catastrophe without any idea it was waiting. That is why the DNA got tested. That is the cruel, ordinary reason. Not suspicion, not a jealous husband, not a soap opera secret. A little boy needed marrow, and finding a donor meant typing the family. And the typing is built on the genetics. And somewhere in that process, a technician noticed something that made no sense, and ran it again, and it still made no sense, and it climbed up the chain to a geneticist. And the geneticist called Rafael and Marisol into a small office and told them, as gently as a person can tell someone the ground is not real, that the standard analysis excluded Rafael as the father of all 3 children. 0%. Not one of them. And the same panel had a second finding, one that seemed to make the impossibility make a terrible ordinary sense. Marisol was, unambiguously, the biological mother of all 3. She was theirs. He was not. To everyone in that room trained to read such things, there was only one explanation that fit. The children were Marisol's and another man's. Rafael had been raising, for 11 years, 3 children that his wife had conceived with someone else and had somehow never known. Marisol fell apart because she knew, with the absolute certainty a mother has, that it was not true, that she had never been with anyone but Rafael, that these were his children, and she had no way on earth to prove it against a laboratory. And Rafael took her hand, and he made his choice in front of everyone, and he refused the obvious story. But you have to understand what that refusal cost, and what it was up against, because within hours the news had traveled the way the worst news always travels, and it reached Gerald Whitmore, and Gerald Whitmore heard, in that laboratory result, the sound of 15 years of waiting finally paying off. He came to the hospital, not to comfort his dying grandson, though he would claim that later. He came to win, and in a hallway outside the pediatric oncology ward, with nurses pretending not to listen, Gerald Whitmore said to his daughter the cruelest, true-sounding thing a father has ever said to a child. He said the paper proved what he had always known, that the marriage was a lie, that she had ruined her life for a man who could not even give her real children, and now she would learn what everyone learns eventually, that blood is the only thing that matters, and that she should have listened to her father. And then he turned to Rafael, and for the first time in 15 years, Gerald Whitmore smiled at him, a smile of pure triumph, and he said the thing that revealed exactly how small his soul had always been. He said, "You're not even their father. You never were. You've got no claim here anymore. It's time for the real family to take care of these children. And he began, that very day, to make calls to lawyers about custody, about Marisol's instability, about getting his grandchildren and his daughter out from under a man who was now conveniently, legally a stranger to the kids he'd raised. Think about the cruelty of the timing. A 5-year-old was dying in a room 40 feet away, and his grandfather's response to a confusing medical result was to weaponize it, to try to shatter the boy's family in the middle of his fight for his life, all to win an argument he had started 15 years earlier at a dinner table. That was Gerald Whitmore, and the horror of it was that the papers seemed to be on his side. The doctors, the lab, the cold machinery of genetics, all of it said Gerald was right and Rafael was a fool or a cuckold. And for about 72 hours, that story hung over everything, and Marisol could barely lift her head under the weight of a betrayal she had not committed. And the whispers started. In the family, in the hospital, the same ugly whispers that follow this kind of thing everywhere. And through all of it, the transplant that could save Lucas sat frozen, because the search for a donor had collided with a genetic mystery no one could solve. And the clock, the real clock, the one attached to a little boy's failing body, kept running. The whispers came fast, and they came from inside, which is the kind that cuts deepest. Marisol's mother, Gerald's wife, a woman who had spent 30 years learning not to contradict her husband, called Marisol and asked her, in a small, ashamed voice, to just tell the truth, that it would be easier for everyone if she just admitted what had happened, that no one would judge her, that these things happen in marriages. Her own mother, Marisol, hung up the phone and slid down the hospital wall to the floor and could not breathe, because if her own mother believed it, if the woman who raised her looked at the paper and assumed the worst, then what chance did she have with anyone else? Aunts stopped calling. A cousin posted something vague and cruel online. And at the hospital, Marisol felt the subtle shift in how some of the staff looked at her. The extra beat of doubt, because they had seen the file too, and a lab result has an authority that a wife's tears do not. She was grieving a possibly dying child and being tried, silently, for a crime she had not committed, at the same time, in the same building. There were hours in there where the only thing that kept Marisol upright was that every time she looked at Rafael, he was already looking back at her, steady, certain, unmoved, telling her without words the same thing over and over. I know you. I know you. I know you. And here is what it cost Rafael to be that steady, because steadiness is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision to stand in front of your doubt, so the people behind you do not have to see it. There was one night, alone in his truck in the hospital parking garage, when Rafael let himself go to the dark place, just for a few minutes, just to look at it. What if? What if he was the fool everyone thought he was? What if 11 years were a lie? He made himself sit inside that possibility, and then he did the thing that defined him. He asked whether, even if it were true, even in the worst version, he would stop being those children's father. And the answer came back so fast and so total that it burned the doubt out of him completely. No, never. He had wiped their fevers and taught them to ride and sat up with their nightmares. Biology could do whatever it wanted. Those were his kids, and he would raise them and love them and, if it came to it, die for them. And no laboratory on Earth had the standing to tell him otherwise. He walked back into the hospital that night lighter than he had gone out, because he had stopped being afraid of the answer, and a man who has stopped being afraid of the answer is free to go and find it. Rafael Duarte did not fall apart, and he did not defend himself with anger, and he did not waste 1 hour of his son's dwindling time trying to convince Gerald Whitmore of anything, because he understood something that his father-in-law never would. Being right is not the same as being loud. Rafael was a man who solved emergencies for a living, and he approached this one the way he approached a bad scene on a highway. He did not argue with the chaos. He looked for the thing everyone else was missing. And the thing everyone was missing was that the story didn't actually fit. He kept coming back to it, in the long nights in the hospital chair, If Marisol had been unfaithful, once, with one man, maybe one child could be another man's. But all three children, across 11 years, and every one of them excluded him, and every one of them was hers. For Marisol to have conceived 3 children with someone other than Rafael, across a decade, without a single one of them being his, in a marriage everyone who knew them described as close, that was not one betrayal. That was a conspiracy of impossibilities. And Rafael, lying awake, kept thinking, the paper isn't lying about the DNA. The DNA is real. So the paper is telling the truth about the genetics, and the wrong story about what it means. The mistake isn't in the numbers. It's in what we think the numbers can only mean. So he did what Gerald Whitmore, for all his money, would never have thought to do. He went looking for someone who knew more. He used every connection he had made in 15 years of medicine, every doctor who had ever ridden in the back of his rig, every specialist who owed a paramedic a favor, and he pushed the case up and up until it landed in front of a young geneticist at the university hospital named Drive. Priya Anand, who read the file and did not see a scandal. She saw a puzzle. She saw a man excluded as the father of 3 children who were unambiguously his wife's, in a family with no other rational story. And instead of accepting the impossible social explanation, she asked the question that a scientist asks and a father-in-law never does. She asked, what if the sample is wrong? Not contaminated, not switched, but wrong in the sense that the cells in Rafael's cheek swab might not be telling the truth about the cells everywhere else in his body. Because there is a phenomenon, rare, documented, real, that almost no one has heard of, and Dr. Anand had. It is called chimerism. It happens when 2 fertilized eggs, 2 non-identical twins, fuse very early in the womb and develop into a single person, a single body built from 2 different genetic lines, a human being who is, in the most literal sense, 2 people merged into one, with one set of DNA in some tissues and a different set in others. Such a person can have one genome in their blood and their saliva, and an entirely different genome in other organs, including the ones that make the cells that make children. A chimeric man could father a child whose DNA matches his reproductive line perfectly, while a cheek swab or a blood test, sampling his other genome, declares him a total stranger to his own son. It had happened before. There was a famous case, a woman nearly prosecuted for fraud because DNA said she wasn't the mother of children she had given birth to, until someone thought to test the right tissue and found her second genome. Dr. Anand looked at Rafael Duarte, a father excluded from 3 of his own children, and she thought, I have seen this shape before. This is not a betrayal. This might be a chimera. She explained it to Rafael and Marisol in her office, and Rafael, who understood the biology faster than most patients would, felt something he had not felt in 3 days. Hope with a spine under it. Because if it was true, it was not just an explanation. It was a testable one, and more than that, more than clearing Marisol's name, more than shattering Gerald Whitmore's ugly story, it meant something that made Rafael grip the edge of the desk. If he was a chimera, if his reproductive DNA was the DNA that had made his children, then that same hidden second genome was the one Lucas had inherited, which meant that Rafael, the man the first test had declared a stranger, might be an even better bone marrow match for his dying son than anyone had realized. The father they had tried to erase might be the exact man who could save the boy's life. But only if they could find the second genome, only if they tested the right part of his body, only if they could do it in time. But hope is not the same as time, and there was very little time. This is the part that Rafael would relive for years, the sheer knife edge of it. Lucas was getting weaker. The relapse was aggressive, and the window in which a transplant could still work was closing. And everyone knew it. And the numbers on the boy's chart were the kind of numbers that make oncologists start speaking more slowly and choosing gentler words. The chimerism testing was not a quick lab order you get back in an afternoon. It meant biopsies from multiple sites, specialized sequencing, careful confirmation, and every day it took was a day subtracted from a 5-year-old's dwindling account. There was a real and terrible possibility, and Rafael faced it squarely because that was who he was, that they would prove the truth too late, that they would find the second genome and the perfect match a week after it could no longer save the boy it belonged to. He begged Drive, Anand, to push, to skip steps, to run things in parallel, and she did everything that could be done, calling in favors of her own, standing over technicians, treating a paternity puzzle like the life-or-death emergency it secretly was. Meanwhile, Gerald's lawyers kept filing, kept circling, and Rafael had to fight a custody battle with one hand while trying to save his son's life with the other, and sleep almost not at all, and keep his face calm for Lucas, who must never, ever see how frightened his father was. What followed was a race, and Rafael ran it the way he had run toward every emergency of his career, with total focus and no wasted motion. The testing for chimerism is not simple. You cannot find a hidden genome by looking in the same place that gave you the first one. Dr. Anand and her team took samples from tissues all over his body, from places the standard test never touches, searching for the second genetic signature that Rafael's cheek and blood had hidden. And Gerald Whitmore, meanwhile, kept pushing his lawyers, kept trying to use the 72-hour-old paper to pry the children loose, kept telling anyone who would listen that his daughter's husband was a proven fraud, right up until the day the new results came back, and the world he had built his cruelty on collapsed in a single sentence. Rafael Duarte was a chimera. The samples proved it beyond any doubt. In his blood and his saliva, one genome, the one the first test had read. In other tissues of his body, a second, distinct genome, the genome of the twin brother he had absorbed in his mother's womb, before he was ever born. The brother who had never been a separate person and yet had lived. All this time, woven silently through Rafael's own flesh, and that second genome, the hidden one, matched. It matched Sophia. It matched Mateo. It matched Lucas. The children were his. They had always been his. 3 children Gerald Whitmore had tried to take. The wife he had branded a liar. The marriage he had spent 15 years trying to prove was a mistake. All of it was vindicated in a laboratory by the discovery that Rafael Duarte was, genetically, in the strangest and most literal way, twice the man anyone had known. He had raised his children with the DNA no test had bothered to look for. He had been their father in his tissue and in his heart at the same time, and the paper had simply been reading the wrong page. Marisol wept when they told her. Not the broken weeping of the last 3 days, but something that came out of her like a dam breaking, because she had known. She had always known. And now the whole world had to know it too. And Rafael held her, and then he did the thing that mattered more than any vindication. He rolled up his sleeve. Because the discovery was not just an answer to a scandal. It was a match for a transplant. Rafael's hidden genome made him a viable bone marrow donor for Lucas. And within days, the father who had been declared a stranger to his son was lying in a hospital bed beside him, giving the boy the very marrow of his bones, the cells of the twin he had carried unknowing since before his own birth, passed now into his dying child. Lucas received his father's marrow. And slowly, over the hard months that followed, the little boy who fell asleep in strange places and laughed at his own jokes began to come back to life. Saved by the exact man that a piece of paper and a bitter old man had tried to erase from his family. Gerald Whitmore was not in the room for any of it. He had made his choice in that hallway, and he could not unmake it. When the truth came out, when the chimerism was confirmed and the whole hospital knew that the ambulance driver had just saved his grandson's life with his own bone marrow, after being publicly branded a fraud, Gerald tried, the way men like him always try, to slide back in as though he had never picked up the knife. He came to the hospital with a soft voice and an expensive gift, and a story about how relieved he was, how glad, how he'd never really doubted. And Rafael Duarte, who did not have a cruel bone in his body, who had absorbed even a twin without malice, met his father-in-law in that hallway one last time and said the only hard thing he ever said to him, quietly, so the children would not hear. "You looked at my son dying," Rafael said, "and you saw a chance to win. I will never keep these kids from their grandfather. because that's not mine to take from them. But you and I both know what you did, and you're going to have to live in the same house as that for the rest of your life. I don't envy you." Then he went back into his son's room, and he closed the door, and Gerald Whitmore stood alone in a hospital hallway, with an expensive gift in his hands, and finally, 15 years too late, understood exactly which of the two of them had always been the bigger man. Marisol and Rafael did not cut Gerald out entirely, because they were better than that, and because Sofia and Mateo and Lucas loved their grandfather with the uncomplicated love children have. But something had shifted permanently, and everyone knew it. Gerald spent the rest of his life trying, in small awkward ways, to earn back a fraction of what he had thrown away in that hallway, and never fully managing it, because some things you cannot buy back once you have shown a person your true face during the worst hour of their life. He had shown Rafael his true face. Rafael had shown him one right back, and the difference between the two faces was the whole story. The recovery was not a single triumphant moment. It was 100 days of holding their breath. A bone marrow transplant is a strange and brutal miracle. First, the doctors have to nearly kill the patient, wiping out the boy's own broken marrow entirely, leaving him with no immune system at all, a child living in a bubble of purified air, where a common cold could end him. Then they give him his father's cells and wait to see whether Raphael's rescued marrow will take root and start making healthy blood, or whether it will fail, or worse, turn on the boy's own body. Raphael and Marisol lived on that knife edge for weeks, watching a counter of blood cells the way other people watch a heartbeat, celebrating a single point of improvement like a birthday. There were setbacks. There was one terrifying week of fever that sent everyone back to the edge of the cliff. But slowly, cell by cell, day by day, Raphael's marrow took hold in his son, and Lucas's own blood began to come back healthy, built now from the DNA of the twin Raphael had carried since the womb. So that in the most literal biological sense, the uncle Lucas never had, was helping to save his life through the father everyone had said was a stranger. And Marisol's mother came, finally, at the end, when the truth was undeniable, and she stood in the doorway of that hospital room and wept, and asked her daughter to forgive her for the phone call, for the doubt. And Marisol, who was a better person than the family that raised her, let her in, because a grandmother's love for a sick child is real even when her courage failed, and because Marisol had learned from the man she married that you do not have to become cruel just because someone was cruel to you. Lucas Duarte grew up. That is the sentence Rafael had prayed for through every needle and every night, and he got it. Lucas grew up healthy, carrying his father's rescued marrow in his bones, and when he was old enough to understand the story, old enough to hear how a test once said his dad wasn't his dad, he asked Rafael about it, the way kids ask about the myths of their own survival. He asked how it felt, that day, to be told his children weren't his. And Rafael Duarte, the paramedic who ran toward every emergency, who had absorbed a brother and raised a family and saved a son with a genome nobody knew he had, gave his boy an answer that Lucas repeated for the rest of his life. For about 10 seconds it was the worst day of my life, Rafael said. And then I looked at your mother, and I looked at the door you were behind, and I remembered something. A number on a page doesn't get to decide who I love. It never did. It can tell me about cells, and I'll listen, because cells matter, and they saved your life. But who my children are, that was never a question a laboratory got to answer. I answered that the day each of you was born, and I've answered it every single day since. And no paper in the world was ever going to change my mind. The science just took a little while to catch up to what I already knew. If you made it to the end of this, hold your people a little tighter tonight, the ones who are yours no matter what any paper says. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and who is the family that's yours by choice and by heart, whatever the blood says. I read everyone.